Good morning, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the Hot Docs at Home platform. My name is Will Denovi. I'm the special programs curator here at Hot Docs, and I am very excited to welcome you all to this special live Q&A for our Rebel Paris Curious Minds series. In just a moment, we are going to be checking in with our Curious Minds lecturer, Lisa Pasold, who's going to help us run through some of the excellent questions that you have submitted to us in response to this exciting new series. I know from chatting with many of you that you're all at maybe different points in the exciting historical journey that Lisa's taking us on in this series. Some of you have already binged the entire thing. Others are savoring the lectures one at a time. And I want to reassure you all that regardless of where you are on this fun historical odyssey, you're going to get just as much out of today's conversation. The topics we're going to cover will address themes that run throughout the full 6 lectures, as well as other topics that Lisa simply didn't have the time or space to address in this series. But either way, Lisa's responses here should hopefully provide some good extra insight that'll only complement and enrich the fun material we've been exploring in these 6 sessions. So now, without any further ado, I'd like to ask you all to join me from the comforts of your home in giving a warm bienvenue to our Curious Minds favorite, Lisa Pasold. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Will. It's really nice to be here, virtually. It's really
Indeed.
nice to chat with you and answer some of these questions. It's really lovely to know that people are out there thinking about the lectures and are curious about some of these great rebels that I have a chance to talk about. It's really a joy.
Indeed. No shortage of great questions for us to run through today. So I'm going to get started right away so we can get to as many of them as we can over the next 30 to 35 minutes or so. And I'll begin with a question from our audience member, Clarissa, who wrote in to ask a little bit about the differences in public attitudes towards art in France and Paris in particular, versus the way that we relate to art in North America. She writes, I always get the sense that art in France is treated as a public good to be celebrated and appreciated by people of all backgrounds and education levels. Whereas in North America, there's tendency to treat it as somehow elitist. Has the rebel spirit in Paris given Parisians of all classes and backgrounds a greater appreciation for the work of artists and their natural tendency to rebel against social norms than the average North American typically has? Or am I oversimplifying things?
That's a great question, Clarissa. And it actually touches on one of my favorite things about France and about Paris specifically. As a writer, when I first was living in Paris, I was always intrigued that in North America, when I would say, well, I'm a writer, a young writer, starting out, everyone would sort of go, and occasionally they'd say, can you make a living doing that? And in Paris, when I got there, everyone would go, and who are your favorite authors? And I love this. And do you think maybe poetry or theater or, movies? What kind of writing do you do? And there was this idea that you were allowed as an individual in the society to have a cultural opinion. And I feel that it's this permission to have an opinion about culture, as opposed to just say, well, intellectual stuff, it's not my thing. Even if your job has nothing to do with the culture of the place, Parisians strongly believe that you are involved in the culture. The culture is yours. I think North America suffers from an anti-intellectual stance that's gotten stronger in the past decade, but we've always suffered from it in a way. We have this Puritan, Presbyterian, anti-pleasure principle. And Lord knows Parisians do not have anything against pleasure. And more importantly, they're really interested in being passionate about opinions, about any sort of argument. And art is one more thing they're really passionate about. They really believe that you should be outspoken and active and interested in what's going on, and what's going on is art often. Um, Parisians really believe that art is necessary. I think it's interesting, right now, the trial of the people who aided the terrorists that carried out the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2015. That trial is going on right now, which has brought up the whole issue of censorship and freedom for the arts very much in the French press. And President Macron has been defending freedom of the press, obviously, because of this topic. And he has talked about the French freedom to blaspheme, which is linked to the freedom of conscience. And I think art has always been on the edge of blasphemy. It's always been rebellious when it's good art, whether it's politically rebellious, socially rebellious. It makes people think, and that alone is an act of rebellion. So, quick answer after all of my longer answer: yes, I really think Paris gives people a sense of responsibility. They should have ideas about art, and as a result, they try to stay educated.
Hmm. And it's striking what you're saying about Macron, because it seems as like an example of the state encouraging the right of people to rebel against the state, almost. Right? There's a
Yes, totally
yeah,
true. That is
yeah.
actually, the strange thing about democracy has always been the fact that you should be allowed to argue with the person in charge, and Parisians very much take that to heart.
Absolutely. Um, you mentioned you mentioned some of the contemporary discussions that are happening right now with the Charlie Hebdo trial. A number of audience members wrote in to ask a little bit about the contemporary moment we find ourselves in. And essentially, to put a fine point on it, do times of crisis like the one we're living through right now inspire rebellion or creativity that leads to significant or long-lasting change? Are there any interesting creative or political developments underway right now in Paris under COVID that are worth highlighting?
I think so, actually. Or maybe I hope so, that there will be good things that come out of this pandemic for all of us. I do think Paris has some advantages and also some disadvantages. The obvious disadvantage is that Paris is a very heavily populated urban space. So, like several other places in Europe and in Asia, it is struggling to cope with the social distancing necessities that the pandemic has brought on. What's interesting is some of the Parisian responses to those demands. Parisians are really trying to keep ahead of the urban planning curve that this has brought on. The city was one of the first, if not the first, to legislate that parking places on some of the streets with lots of cafes and restaurants, those parking places would be suppressed. The cafes and restaurants would be allowed to use outdoor space, set up outdoor space. So Parisians had somewhere to go when they were released from their intense quarantine in their apartments, so that Parisians had a place to go so they could be out and use their city, be in their city in a safer way. So that's actually made a big difference to the way people interact in the city of Paris. Also, the mayor has always been very pro bicycle, but the pandemic made Parisians very pro bicycle because the public transit, especially the metros, are very well used in Paris, which means they are very crowded. And those of you who are listening who are in cities, like Toronto with a subway system, you know how crowded that can be. And Parisians have been taking advantage of the bicycle rental system in Paris, and the mayor has put in a whole bunch of new bicycle lanes to try to encourage people, give them more space to use their city, get around their city in a safe way. So yeah, Paris is using urban planning to try to address this pandemic in very creative ways. So yes, I do think that's helping. What we're going to have to see is how that works out as it gets cooler. The Parisians I've been talking to, my friends right now, are saying, well, this is great. You know, we're organizing outdoor events in parks. It's wonderful. However, the rainy season starts in October and it gets cold in Paris in winter, not as cold as Canada, but cold and damp. So what happens then? We don't know. But so far, Paris has really been trying to address the pandemic. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it certainly raises lots of interesting questions for the future of Rebel Paris, which is a theme again many audience members wrote in to ask about. Um, I mean, I think even before the current pandemic, there were there were questions about what the combined forces of gentrification and globalization might mean for the city's bohemian tradition and by extension its rebel spirit. And certainly a few audience members wrote in to ask about that. Are we seeing a kind of a cultural uniformity across world cities now that maybe inhibits the kind of idiosyncratic conditions that have made Paris such a hotbed for intellectual and political rebellion? Do you have any thoughts on that idea?
I do. Yeah, I touch on it occasionally in the lectures, so it makes sense that people would ask more about it. So thank you for picking up on that, people who have been listening to the lectures. Yes, Paris has always been a very cosmopolitan city. You know, for about 1,000 years, it's been very cosmopolitan. So it's interesting to see what happens as all of these cosmopolitan but very individualized places in the world are hit with this globalization of big box shops and Airbnb gentrification surges and all of these problems. Paris is very lucky in that it is still a city that has an astonishingly high number of small entrepreneurs. Small businesses are actually one of the forces in Paris, unlike, say, London, which in the past 20 years has lost a lot of its small businesses. The high streets, the English shopping streets across London are really pervaded by the same repeated brands, Paper Chase, Tesco, etc. And Paris does have some of that problem. You know, there are Monoprix everywhere, and certain brands, Sephora's, are very powerful as a brand in Paris. But there are also innumerable tiny businesses that really, you know, when I think of my own high street of Rue Poteau in the 18th, which is where I do my grocery shopping, where I go to market, there's an independent organic fruit and vegetable shop that replaced the previous not organic fruit and vegetable shop, also independent. There's, you know, a Monoprix, yes, a large and functional supermarket chain, but there's also an independent bookshop, there's an independent comic shop, there's the independent hairdresser, and 3 independent shops that sell clothing, as well as a couple of chains. So they're managing to hang in with this melange of small entrepreneurs and big brands. Hopefully that will continue. We'll see. But Paris is really fighting, as opposed to, I feel that some cities have just given up against the large brands, feeling that there is no way to win. Paris never lost its downtown. Paris never lost its small shopping streets and individual neighborhood feelings. So that is really strong. The big problem in Paris right now is Airbnb and similar short-term rentals, because it has hollowed out neighborhoods like Saint-Germain. And we'll see. I mean, the pandemic's having an interesting impact on that. And certainly the mayor of Paris for the last 5 years has been fighting Airbnbs and short-term rentals with all kinds of huge fines. So we'll see in the long term how that pans out globally with the short-term rental issue. So we'll see. But I do think Paris is rebelling in some ways that are consistent. You know, the French have this belief in terroir, that the water and the land impact what happens there. And sometimes I think the swampy land of Paris is just profoundly set up to raise rebellious citizens, because Parisians have never taken things sitting down.
Hmm. And I'm curious, Lisa, I mean, for creative professionals like yourself, the rich community of writers and artists that have always flourished in Paris, you're seeing signs that despite the Airbnb-ification of the city and these other alarming trends, that there will still continue to be a vibrant community of rebellious artists and creators heading into the future. They're not all getting priced out and moving to Normandy or or
So
or
far,
Lille or
no.
something. Yeah.
There has been a move to less central parts of the city. For example, the 19th, the 20th arrondissements are, for the last 20 years have been growing in cultural importance. There are more interesting bookshops over there along the Canal Saint-Martin, up one of the talks for Rebel Paris is actually about the 19th, and up around the Belleville area, there are some wonderful new galleries that do fascinating events. What's interesting right now with the pandemic is there are some really fascinating outdoor events being organized in the city of Paris. Paris has always had a very strong, what they call street arts, circus performance and other outdoor in the street sort of festivals and performance. So the citizens have really been taking advantage of that. And I don't think we're in danger of losing that anytime soon, although it is still really difficult for people to find living space, and visual artists who work in larger forms mostly have gone into the suburbs at this point. So yeah.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah. I mean, you obviously, over the course of the lectures, and especially in those early lectures, you shared some wonderful maps with us that let us sort of situate these rebel hotspots within the broader city. Would you say is it fair to say that, when you first moved to Paris, this was when in the 90s?
I first got to Paris in 1989.
1989.
Yes.
Okay.
I was, of
So
course, 5. No, I'm joking. I moved to
right.
Paris as soon as I got out of university. And I went, initially, I actually went to France to cover the Cannes Film Festival, which was amazing. And then I thought, I'm in France. So I went up to Paris and got a job. And I first lived in Bastille. And initially, that Bastille area was becoming gentrified. Theaters were open there. They had just built the Opera, giant opera building in Bastille. So that neighborhood changed massively. And then I lived in the Upper Marais, which again changed massively. And now I live in the 18th, which has changed, but is still quite a rebellious area. I don't think they'll ever quite get the rebellion out of Montmartre. It's always been rebellious. So yeah, I have seen the city change, but I think healthy cities do change and evolve. And they go through phases that, are regrettable, like some of the gentrification, emptying out syndrome we've seen in the 5th and 6th. But they also evolve and come back, and neighborhoods that fall apart come back and are renewed. So I'm not giving up hope on the center of Paris in any way.
That's very reassuring. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit here to, I think, a really interesting question that our audience member Sandra wrote in with. Does the rebel spirit ever hold Parisians and the French more generally back in any way? Does their proclivity for strikes and their inherent mistrust of authority ever prove counterproductive and prevent society from functioning as effectively and as efficiently as it could or should? Or put another way, do Parisians ever get sick of the constant public sector strikes and express regrets about their city's rebellious nature?
Simple answer, yes, constantly. But Parisians love to argue. So if the city were running in this sort of amazing, efficient way, which I'm not sure cities should be efficient, but we'll get back to that in a moment. If Paris worked in this perfect, beautifully organized, everybody follows the rules kind of way, and there were never any strikes, Parisians would complain about that while drinking their perfect wine in their cafe and, adjusting their scarf. They would be dissatisfied either way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
However,
yeah,
also,
yeah.
I do think Parisians believe that they individually have the right to protest and strike. So no matter how frustrated they are by the strikes, they do believe that they have the right to protest. And if their right were taken away, they would be furious. So on some level, you have to intellectually accept that there are going to be protests that inconvenience you personally if you believe that you have the right to protest. There was a lot of discomfort around some of the uh, protests about the Gilets jaunes going on, because there was initially a feeling that those were not Parisians protesting, those were people coming in. A lot of the influence was from the right and the far right,
Mhm.
and Parisians were very upset about those protests. And they are, of course, very upset when protests turn violent. But overall, Parisians actually excel at nonviolent protests and nonviolent demonstrations. They have massive demonstrations pretty well seasonally, and it is relatively rare that those devolve into violence when you consider how few demonstrations other places have. Paris actually is pretty good at that sort of thing. So yes,
Mhm.
we all get sick of the metro being on strike or there being yet another reason you can't do something easily. But I think if a city is going to evolve as a great cosmopolitan center with lots of people doing interesting, creative things to the way one lives in a city, you are not necessarily going to end up with a smoothly operating city. You're going to have solid infrastructure. Paris has great infrastructure. It's
Mm.
one of the most functional cities in the world from that point of view. And yet it also struggles with all of these protests and breakdowns. But I think it manages to keep it in balance. And I think that balance, that tension between obedient citizens and perfectly functioning efficiency and disobedient citizens trying to improve the way things work, because let's face it, we don't live in a perfect society. Let's try to improve it. I think that tension really helps Paris be a great place to live.
Yeah, it's fascinating you say that because it's this balance of on the as you say on the one hand it's protest to try to make things better, but then also built on a foundation of an infrastructure that's already working fairly well, serving the public good fairly well. Whereas I'm just thinking of a city like New York where things break down and are inefficient all the time, but it's not because of mass protests to make things better. It's just because the subway system hasn't been updated in 80 years and is falling apart. But it's interesting what you're saying. The idea that maybe a little bit of inefficiency is actually healthy for a society.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
yeah.
without unrest and without this sort of friction, I think Parisians would be poorer. I think culturally, politically, socially, I think Paris needs a certain amount of friction to be itself. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Um, so we're nearing the end of our half hour here, but there are a couple final interesting questions that I want us to get to. Our audience member, Curious Minds regular Stephen Lico wrote in with I thought a really interesting question. He writes, France didn't grant women the vote until after World War II, which was much later than Canada, the United States, and most of Western Europe. Lisa, what were the factors that led to such a late granting of this right? Secondly, who are your standout Parisian rebels who were involved in the suffragette movement?
Okay, I'll try and be brief. Yes, France is appalling for this. Australia gave the vote to women in 1901, Canada in 1916, England and the US followed soon after. France started out fairly well. Paris had the Union pour le suffrage des femmes. It was founded by Parisian feminists in 1909. And then the vote for women just fell apart. It's weird because in France, unlike in other countries, the right, the conservatives, supported the vote for women because the Pope Benoit the 15th, I think, had declared that women should have the vote. So good Catholics in France went, okay, well, women should have the vote. And it was actually the left and the far right in the Senate that kept stalling the bill to allow women the vote. So it's a very weird situation. And I think it's partly because the French had this idea that women should be the power behind the throne. And they could not get rid of this idea. Unlike, say, in England, who, England had an incredibly powerful queen who was one of their better rulers. So at least somewhere in their brain, they had gotten over that idea. The French never did. Strangely, also, the left argued through the 30s that Hitler had come to power because of the women's vote. How they came to that conclusion, a long discussion. But anyway, the French used that as an argument to not get women the vote. And finally, I'm no fan of General de Gaulle, but finally in 1944, he pushed it through and women got the vote in France. They first voted in, I think it was a municipal election in April 1945. And one of my favorite suffragettes in France is a woman called Séverine. Séverine, that was the pen name of Caroline Rémy de Guebard. She lived from 1855 to 1929, and she was this incredibly successful journalist. You might have seen a painting of her by Renoir. It's in a collection in the US, might be Washington, I can't remember, but Séverine, really fascinating woman, anarchist socialist who wrote in defense of Dreyfus during the Dreyfus affair, which was very radical. And she actually resigned from the Communist Party in the 20s because she was appalled by what was going on in the Soviet Union, which was very radical. Most communists at that point were towing the line. So yeah, she's fascinating and a great suffragette. So yeah, look her up.
And maybe take us into the present a little bit. Are there any sort of notable women in contemporary politics or culture in Paris right now who you think of as sort of the inheritors of Séverine's tradition?
I like to think that feminism has taken hold strongly enough in France that we don't have to focus on being suffragettes at this point. I actually really admire the current mayor, though, Anne Hidalgo, the current mayor of Paris, though she is not known for playing well with others. She's an incredibly smart woman, and I think she's done really well to steer Paris through some ghastly terrorist attacks and this pandemic. I think she's doing a fantastic job. But yeah,
Okay.
creative and cultural, there's just too many to list in
Too many.
a couple of minutes.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
But absolutely. Anne Hidalgo is someone who is really, I mean, even internationally, I think a lot of folks in North America, especially who are looking for innovative ideas that they can bring back and apply to their own cities, are looking to many of the things you've been mentioning, what she's doing with bikes, her response to the pandemic, a remarkable figure.
She's really tried to be out there, present in people's lives, which is really impressive, actually, given the constraints she's working under right now. So, yeah.
All right, Lisa, we've got time for one more question, and it's a very fun one that actually came in from a couple different audience members. But it's sort of a parlor game that I think we often play here at Curious Minds when we interview our favorite lecturers, and basically we want to know if you are hosting a dinner party and you can invite any 3 rebels from the history of Paris, who do you invite? And equally important, what is on the menu?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, people. Well, of course, you all must come to the dinner party. I think we should give the menu over to revolutionary pharmacist Parmentier, who, of course, was obsessed with potatoes, but he apparently threw wonderful dinner parties. And he had great ideas of what to serve, 5-course meals with accompanying wine. So we're going to put Parmentier in charge of the menu. I'm not going to deal with that at all. I'll just show up and enjoy whatever he comes up with. And I'm sure he'll have good wine pairings for us. And for guests, I think I would definitely invite Georges Sand, the writer, the 19th century best-selling writer, because she, first of all, was known to be a brilliant dinner companion. And I think she'd have a lot to say. She was always interested in everything. So she would be wonderful to talk with. And you need people who will get along at a dinner party. So I would probably invite the fascinating composer, the Chevalier Saint-Georges, because he would be able to talk about music. I love talking about music and I love his compositions. And he'd probably have a few great sword fighting anecdotes as well, because he was an international fencing star, as well as being a very accomplished Black French composer in the 18th century, which is quite remarkable. And so I'd love to have him to dinner, yes. And the third guest, I think I would invite the medieval bard François Villon. Of course, we'd have to convince him not to steal the silverware, but I think he'd be fascinating and he'd be a great combination with Georges Sand and the Chevalier Saint-Georges and Villon. I think we'd have a really dynamic dinner conversation as we ate our potatoes parmentier. And
Yes.
yeah.
Well, it sounds like a great dinner party, a great balance of personalities and perspectives there. And I like what you're saying. They're each rebels in their own right, but they wouldn't be so rebellious as to just, to spark conflict at the dinner table. We'd
You
hit
don't
that.
want a food fight, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That sweet spot between individual rebellion and collective harmony. Well, that sounds delightful. So, Lisa, we've run out of time now, but it is, as always, a pleasure to check in with you and get your great insights into all things Paris. I know you're currently visiting family in Canada, but you'll be heading back to Paris this fall. What are the things you're most excited for when you get back home? What will be the things you're missing the most and that you're going to enjoy the most as soon as you get back to the city?
Well, two of my favorite things about Paris are, of course, my friends there. I'm really looking forward to reconnecting with the artistic community in Paris. And I'll really look forward to just walking through the city and seeing, how the city is doing. I know there have been a lot of changes because of the pandemic, and I'm looking forward to just walking through them myself and, checking that out. I also have some great reports from friends who say what's great right now is the museums are empty. So
Right.
it might be fun to spend, a day at the Louvre, just enjoying some of the rooms that are usually really crowded, like the Italian Masters and the French medieval rooms that I really love. Those rooms apparently right now are not that crowded. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. So.
All right. Well, something to look forward to. For all of our friends at home who have been loving your series, when we hope to have you back here at Curious Minds again soon. But in the meantime, where can they go to find more of your wonderful work?
Well, please join my newsletter. My website is lisapasold.com. It's very easy to find. Join my newsletter and then you can get updates. I do podcasts that are short walks through a street in Paris. I do about one a month, though I'm a month behind this month, but I was working for Curious Minds, so I have an excuse. But yeah, check that out. I do these improbable walks through Paris. They're a free podcast. You can sign up through my website. And I also am working on a new book, so we'll see how that pans out. So yeah, sign up and then you'll not miss anything. And you'll stay up to date on everything I do with you guys at Curious Minds.
Well, wonderful. We will be sending all of you at home another follow-up email in the next couple of weeks with the recording of this conversation, along with some additional further reading suggestions to complement Lisa's series. And I'll, of course, include a link there as well to Lisa's website, so you can sign up for that newsletter and find out more about what she's up to. So in the meantime, on behalf of the entire team here at Hot Docs, heartfelt thank you to Lisa for all the great stories, insights, characters you've shared with us in Rebel Paris. And a hearty thank you to all of you at home for joining us this morning and for all you do to support curious minds and hot docs. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.